In this final video for this week's lecture unit, what I'll do is just briefly cover some other elements of music we should consider beyond rhythm and pitch. These are mainly texture, timbre, form, and instrumentation. And then we'll conclude with just a thought about how we can use this moving forward in the course. So let's start with texture. Texture refers to the amount of voices that we hear in a piece of music or in a musical performance and how they relate to one another. When we say voices, we basically mean different types of instruments, literal voices, the sounds that are present in a musical performance. So a clarinet can be a voice can be a voice, a flute, a drum in some ways. And we're concerned with how they relate to one another. Are they playing with each other? Are they playing the same musical line, the same melody? Are they playing different parts? And how does that complement or contrast with one another? So generally we think of textures as being sparse or transparent or clear. So think about somebody singing and maybe accompanying themselves on guitar. If the singing isn't all too powerful and if the guitar playing isn't super loud, we could think of that as a sparser texture. There's not as much going on musically. There's not as many voices in the texture. Now, of course, if the singer is growling and shouting and playing perhaps an electric guitar and it's very loud, that could actually be a thicker texture. But think of that as being transparent and open. You can hear the parts clearly. There isn't a bunch of clutter and sound on top of each other. Now, dense textures are textures that usually do have a lot of sound on top of sound on top of sound. This could be due to the fact that you have a lot of different instruments and voices playing at the same time. So think of like an orchestra playing a whole bunch of different lines and parts at the same time. That's very full and dense. Think of a metal group, a metal rock group, right? And how full the electric guitar sound, the drums, everything. You can also have a dense texture if the actual sound quality of the instrument or the voice is very powerful and heavy. So in some musical practices and musical cultures, performers attach rattles and bottle caps. This particularly happens in sub-Saharan Africa. And they do that to make their instruments sound more buzzy, to have a fuller, more dense texture. All right. But when we talk about texture, we also talk about it in terms of shapes, the relationships between melodies and harmonies. All right. So remember, a melody is basically our pitches and ascending and descending patterns of some type. And then our harmony is what we have when two or more pitches are sounded, two or more different pitches are sounded at the same time. So we can have monophonic lines, which is pretty much just the melody, one line being sung by itself. That's like when earlier I was singing America the Beautiful, I was just singing the melodic line. No, beautiful, first spacious, right? That's just a monophonic line, one, mono. Now we can have homophonic lines. And what this basically is having the main melody, but then also an accompaniment to go with that. And so the best way to think of this is having a main melody and then someone playing chords that follow along with the melody underneath. So think of someone singing America the Beautiful and also playing piano along with that or accompanying themselves on guitar. Now we'll get into some more complicated harmonic and actual textures too. So polyphony is when you have melodies, right? Two or more distinct parts, specifically melodies, playing at the same time, sounding at the same time. I like this graphic here because you can see, look at these independent melodies that are singing, again, independently from each other. So this is what is going to differentiate monophonic texture from polyphonic texture. In this case, we just have one texture. We have one line singing by itself, one voice. In this case, we have three different voices singing three distinct parts. They're independent from each other. All right? And then we have heterophonic texture. So this one's kind of a variation where it's very similar to monophonic texture, except for you have more than one voice singing the same or a similar part, but usually at least one or more of those voices is playing a variation of that part. So singing the same melody, but one singer may add some vocal flares and frills and trills, even though they're singing the same melody essentially. All right? So these are the four main texture shapes that we'll talk about throughout the semester. And, we'll probably spend a lot of time with homophonic texture. That's a pretty prominent one, especially in Western art music. But we'll see examples of all in the various musical practices that we study. Cool. So one thing you can do to just solidify this idea is listen to the video I have pasted in the module below this. It's actually showing you how the very basic melody of row, row, row your boat changes when you change the texture that accompanies it. So you'll see a monophonic example, you'll see a polyphonic example, a homophonic example, just like we talked about. All right, so the next thing to consider then is timbre. Timbre is essentially the sound quality, the tone color of the different instruments and voices you may hear. I think I mentioned this before, but it's the way that you can tell the difference between one man's voice and another man's voice. Or you can tell the difference between a cat and a dog, right? Or a guitar and a piccolo. Timbre is essentially sound quality, and it's based off what we call the harmonic series, which is going back to the idea of frequency and pitches and all of the different frequencies that exist and combine when we make a sound. Interestingly, when we talk or when we make a sound on an instrument, we're not just playing one singular note. Even though we perceive that as human beings, what's happening is that as I'm talking, I'm actually producing several different notes at one time, several different frequencies, but you're hearing a main fundamental frequency that's overpowering all the others. But the fact that there are other frequencies on top of that fundamental, that's actually what gives my voice a very unique timbre. It's a combination of frequencies that come together and shape the sound of our voices. On top of that, the timbre also changes based on the material of the instrument. So the fact that my voice, right, it starts with vibrations in my vocal cords. Those vocal cord vibrations go up, and they're actually shaped, the sound of that, by the size of my mouth, my nose. If I'm sick, I'll sound stuffier because my nose, right, is made up of a different quantity at that point. But same for instruments too. This is why guitars, for instance, come in all different shapes and sizes, because the shape, the size, and the material, so like the wood the guitar is made up of, changes the timbre of that sound. So that's what timbre is, right? And we generally use adjectives to describe timbre, so things like it's a very bright timbre. Someone's voice can be really mellow, right? A trumpet or a horn can be very brassy, smooth, rattling. So this is the way we generally describe tone colors in music.